My parents mocked me for marrying below my class. Then the truth came out. I remember the exact sound my mother's laugh made when she found out Daniel worked with his hands. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was short, sharp, almost surgical, the kind of laugh that's meant to cut a person down to the right size before they get too comfortable in a room. We were standing in my parents' kitchen, the one with the marble island that cost more than Daniel's first car. And I had just told her we were engaged. She didn't hug me. She didn't even put down the wine glass she was holding. She just looked at the ring on my finger, small and simple. Nothing like the family heirloom she used to dangle in front of me as a girl, and she said, "Well, I suppose someone has to fix the cars of people who actually matter." I was 31 years old in that moment, but I felt about 8. That's the strange thing about family. No matter how far you climb, how many degrees you earn, how many rooms you learn to walk into with your shoulders back, one sentence from a parent can shrink you down to the child who used to sit on the stairs listening to grown-ups decide her worth. My name is Claire. I grew up in a house with a circular driveway and a name that meant something in our town, Ashworth, a name stitched into the local hospital wing, the university library, the golf club's founding plaque. My father, Richard Ashworth, built Ashworth Textiles into something people whispered about with respect, a self-made empire, or so the story went, the one he told at every dinner party, at every charity gala, at every Thanksgiving table where he'd raise his glass and remind us all that he came from nothing and built everything with his own 2 hands. I believed that story for 31 years. Daniel and I met at a hardware store, which is a detail my mother liked to repeat at parties as though it were the punchline to a joke. I was buying paint for my first apartment, badly, clumsily, holding 2 shades of gray up to the fluorescent light trying to decide which one wouldn't make my studio look like a hospital room. And this man in a flannel shirt with sawdust on his forearms asked if he could help. He owned a small carpentry and restoration business, the kind that repairs old furniture, rebuilds porches, restores the bones of houses that other people had given up on. He had calloused hands and a laugh that came easy and often, and within 6 months I knew I wasn't going to spend my life with anyone else. My parents did not share my certainty. The first time I brought Daniel to a family dinner, my father asked him 3 questions about his 5-year plan, and then spent the rest of the meal talking to my brother Preston about stock options. My mother asked Daniel, with a smile so thin it barely qualified as one, whether he'd ever considered something more stable, dear, something with a real trajectory. Daniel, to his credit, answered every question with patience and warmth, and when we got in the car afterward, he just reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "They'll come around." They never came around. For 3 years, every family gathering carried the same undertone, a kind of polite condescension dressed up as concern. My mother would ask if we were doing all right financially in front of guests. My father would make comments about marrying for status versus marrying for love, as though those were the only 2 options, and as though he hadn't married my mother, whose family owned 3 department stores before he ever set foot in a boardroom. My older sister Vanessa, who'd married a hedge fund manager named Grant, would give me looks across the table, looks that said she pitied me, that she'd gotten it right and I'd gotten it wrong. The night everything started to unravel was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. It was held at the country club, the big one, the one with the chandeliers my mother liked to say were imported from Vienna, though I never once saw proof of that. 200 guests. A string quartet. My father in his tailored navy suit, working the room like he was running for office, telling anyone who'd listen the story of how he built Ashworth Textiles from a single loom in a rented garage. I'd heard that story my whole life. The lone visionary. The man who bet everything on himself and won. I used to be proud of it. I used to repeat it to teachers, to friends, to Daniel in the early days back when I still believed every word of it. That night, something small happened that I didn't think much of at the time. An old man approached my father near the bar. A thin man with white hair and a cane, someone I didn't recognize. He said something to my father that made my father's face go pale for just a second, just a flicker, before the practiced smile slid back into place. My father put a hand on the man's shoulder, guided him toward the door, and I saw him hand the man an envelope. Cash, I assumed, though I couldn't be sure. The old man left without touching the food, without a drink, without staying for a single photo. I asked my father about it later. He waved me off. "Old business associate," he said, asking for a handout, like they always do when they see money in a room. He said it so easily, so smoothly that I almost let it go. Almost. But there was something about the way that old man had looked at my father. Not like a stranger asking for charity. Like someone who was owed something and had waited a very long time to say so. For a while I tried to talk myself out of caring about it. I told myself I was reading too much into a stranger's face. That grief and imagination can turn an ordinary moment into something sinister if you let them. But the image kept surfacing at odd times while I was folding laundry, while I was waiting at a red light. The old man's eyes, steady and unblinking, fixed on my father like he'd rehearsed that look for years. And my father's hand on his shoulder, gentle on the surface, but with a firmness underneath that looked less like comfort and more like control, the kind of grip you use to steer someone quickly toward an exit. I mentioned it to Daniel that night, lying in the dark, both of us too wired from the party to sleep. Something about it felt wrong, I told him. Like watching two actors perform a scene they'd rehearsed 100 times. Except one of them had stopped believing in the script. Daniel didn't say much. He just held my hand and said, "Families keep things buried for reasons. Sometimes good ones, sometimes not. You'll know which kind this is if you ever find out." I didn't think about it again for almost 2 months, until my grandmother's estate sale. My grandmother, my father's mother, had passed the year before, and the family had been slow, painfully slow in going through her things. She'd lived in the same modest house in the old part of town her entire life, even after my father became wealthy enough to buy her a mansion twice the size of the one he lived in. She'd always refused. "I like my house," she used to tell me. "I like remembering who I used to be." I loved my grandmother more than almost anyone in that family. She was the only one who never once looked at Daniel like he was a mistake I'd made. When I brought him to meet her, she took his hand in both of hers and said, "A man who works with his hands understands the value of things. That's rare in this family now." I didn't fully understand what she meant by that sentence until much later. It fell to me to clear out her house since Vanessa was too busy and Preston didn't do well with sentimental things, which was a phrase he used to avoid anything that wasn't profitable. Daniel came with me every weekend for a month. We went through closets full of old dresses, drawers full of photographs, a whole life folded into boxes. It was in the back of her bedroom closet, behind a false panel that Daniel noticed only because he'd spent his whole career learning how old houses were built, that we found the metal lockbox. It wasn't locked. I think she wanted someone to find it eventually. Inside were letters, dozens of them, bundled with a faded ribbon, along with a stack of yellowed papers that looked like ledgers, and a black and white photograph of 2 young men standing in front of a small brick building, arms slung over each other's shoulders, both of them grinning like the whole world was still ahead of them. I recognized one of the men immediately. It was my father, maybe 22 years old, thinner, with a mustache he definitely regretted later in life. I did not recognize the other man. Not at first. Daniel did. He went very quiet, staring at the photograph, and then he said in a voice I'd never heard him use before, low and strange, "Claire, I think that's my grandfather." I want you to understand that Daniel rarely talked about his grandfather. He died when Daniel was a teenager, and from what little Daniel had shared, the man had been poor his whole life, worked as a machine repairman in a series of failing mills, and had passed away with almost nothing to his name. Daniel kept one photo of him on the bookshelf in our apartment, a stern-faced man in overalls, and that was the extent of what I knew. We sat down on the floor of my grandmother's closet with that lockbox between us, and we started reading. The first letter was dated nearly 40 years earlier, written in a careful, looping handwriting that I would later learn belonged to Daniel's grandfather, a man named Walter Hale. It was addressed to my grandmother, not my father, which struck me as strange until I read further and understood why. The letter described a loan. A significant one. Walter Hale had lent my father $18,000, an enormous sum at the time, everything Walter had saved over a decade of working double shifts at the mill, so that my father could buy the single loom that would supposedly become the seat of Ashworth Textiles. The letter wasn't angry. It was almost gentle, the tone of a man who trusted a friend completely and had no reason to think otherwise. He wrote that he believed in Richard's vision, that he was proud to be part of something that would change both our families' futures, that he only asked for the loan to be repaid, with the modest interest they'd agreed on, once the business found its footing. The second letter was dated 8 years later. The tone had changed. Walter was still polite, painfully polite, the kind of politeness that comes from a person who doesn't yet want to believe he's being wronged. He mentioned that Ashworth Textiles had opened its second factory. He mentioned reading about my father in the local paper, described as a self-made success story. He gently reminded my father of the loan, said he understood business took time, said his own family was struggling, that his wife was sick, that he wasn't asking for it all at once, just an acknowledgement that the debt still existed. There was no letter back from my father in the box. Only my grandmother's handwriting on a separate scrap of paper, a private note to herself it seemed, that simply read, "Richard says Walter is being dramatic. Says the business needs every dollar right now. I don't know what to believe anymore." The third letter was the one that made my hands shake. It was dated less than 2 years before Walter Hale died. By then, Ashworth Textiles had 4 factories. My father had been profiled in a regional business magazine calling him a visionary entrepreneur, who started with nothing but grit and a single loom. Walter's letter this time was shorter, sadder. He wrote that he no longer expected repayment. He wrote that he'd stopped mentioning it to his own family because he was ashamed that he'd trusted so completely and been treated so carelessly. The last line of that letter has stayed with me every day since I read it. He wrote, "I don't need the money to make me whole anymore, Richard. I needed you to remember where you started. I hope your children never learn what building a life on someone else's back looks like." There was a ledger too in my grandmother's handwriting, dates and small amounts, $5 here, $10 there. Cash she had apparently been sending to Walter's family quietly for years on her own behind my father's back, a private act of conscience that she never told anyone about. Little scraps of guilt money, sent to a family my father had built his entire fortune on the back of, and then simply let struggle. I looked up at Daniel. He was staring at the ledger, at his own last name written over and over in my grandmother's careful cursive, and his eyes were wet, though he wasn't crying, not really, just present with something enormous. "He never told me any of this," Daniel said quietly. "He never told my dad either, I don't think. He just let us believe he'd failed. My whole childhood, people talked about him like he just never made anything of himself. We kept reading long after the light through my grandmother's bedroom window had turned orange and then gray. There was a 4th item in the lockbox, smaller than the letters, easy to miss beneath the ribbon. A single business card, cheap cardstock, the kind you'd order in bulk from a print shop in the early years of a small operation. It read Ashworth and Hale, Fine Woven Goods, with a smudged address on a street that no longer existed under that name. I turned it over in my fingers for a long time. Ashworth and Hale. Not Ashworth alone. There had been a version of this company, however briefly, that carried both their names, before someone decided one of those names needed to disappear from the letterhead entirely. "He didn't just lend the money," I said quietly, mostly to myself. "He was supposed to be a partner. An actual partner." Daniel took the card from me and studied it the way he studied old wood, running his thumb along the edge as if the material itself might tell him something the ink couldn't. "My grandfather used to have this expression," he said. "My dad told me about it once. Whenever something didn't add up, whenever a customer shorted him on a job, he'd just say, quiet as anything, 'Some debts don't show up on paper, but they're still owed.' I always thought it was just something old men say. I think now he might have meant it literally." We sat there a long time after that, not talking, just passing the card back and forth between us, 2 ordinary words on a piece of cheap cardstock, quietly rewriting everything I thought I understood about where my family's money had come from. That was the moment the story of my family, the story I had been raised inside of like a second skin, cracked open in my hands. I didn't confront my father right away. I want to be honest about that because I think if I had done it in that first white-hot rush of anger, I would have handled it badly, and it wouldn't have landed the way it needed to land. Instead, Daniel and I spent the next several weeks doing something quieter. We did our homework. Daniel's mother still had a small box of his grandfather's old things in her attic, things she'd never fully gone through because it hurt too much. Inside we found Walter's old work ledger from the mill, pay stubs showing wages that made my stomach turn when I compared them to what I knew my father's company had been worth at the same time. We found a savings passbook, the kind banks used to issue, showing a large withdrawal in the exact amount mentioned in that first letter. Dated the same month Ashworth Textiles was officially registered as a company. I also went to see my grandmother's old lawyer, A soft-spoken man named Arthur Bellamy who had handled her affairs for 40 years and who, it turned out, had also witnessed the original loan agreement between my father and Walter Hale, back when he was a young associate at his firm. He still had a copy in his archives, an actual signed promissory note, my father's signature on it clear as day, dated and notarized, promising repayment within 5 years at 4% interest. Your father asked me once, years later, to destroy that file, Arthur told me, folding his hands on his desk. I told him client records don't work that way. He didn't like that answer. We didn't speak again after that, not really, except at your grandmother's request for her own paperwork. I sat in Arthur's office holding a photocopy of that promissory note, and something inside me went very still and very cold and very clear. I thought about every dinner where my father had told his self-made story. I thought about every time my mother had looked at Daniel like he was a lesser version of a man, like his hands, his work, his honest and unglamorous labor made him unworthy of their daughter. I thought about the old man at the anniversary party, the one my father had quietly paid off and hustled out the door before anyone could ask questions, and I understood now with total certainty that the man had been Walter's son, Daniel's own father, showing up to ask, one more time, for some acknowledgement of what his family had sacrificed. There was one more piece I needed before I felt ready to sit across from my father with any real authority, and that was understanding what had actually happened to the name Hale on that business card. I found it in the county records office on a Thursday afternoon, in a manila folder of incorporation documents so old the pages had gone soft at the corners. Ashworth and Hale, Fine Woven Goods, had been registered as a two-person partnership the same year as that first letter. 4 years later a new filing appeared. Ashworth Textiles, sole proprietor Richard Ashworth. No mention of any partner. No dissolution paperwork on file showing that Walter had agreed to be bought out. No signature from him anywhere in the folder at all. Just a quiet erasure, filed away in a drawer where almost no one would ever think to look. I sat in that records office with the folder open in my lap, and felt something settle in me that was heavier than anger. It was closer to grief, the specific grief of realizing a story you loved was never true in the first place. I thought about every framed magazine clipping in my father's office, every speech at every gala, every time he'd told strangers he'd built Ashworth Textiles alone, from nothing, through sheer will. I thought about how many times I had repeated that story myself, proudly, to teachers, to friends, to Daniel in our early days together, without a single fact underneath it holding true. I did not want to burn my family down in public. I want to be clear about that because it would have been easy. I had the documents. I had the letters. I could have stood up at any gathering and destroyed my father's reputation in front of everyone who mattered to him. And there were nights, lying awake next to Daniel, where I thought about doing exactly that. But that's not who I wanted to be, and more importantly, it's not what Walter Hale's own letters had asked for. He never wanted revenge. He wanted to be remembered honestly. He wanted his family's sacrifice to matter, to be seen, not to become a spectacle. So instead I planned something quieter. Something that would give my father exactly one chance to do the right thing on his own, in private, before I ever let the truth see daylight. I asked to meet him for lunch. Just the two of us, no mother, no siblings, at a small diner across town, not the country club, not one of his usual places where he could perform for an audience. He was surprised by the location but agreed, probably assuming I wanted to talk about wedding anniversary gifts for my mother, or some other harmless family matter. I brought a folder. I didn't say much at first. I let him order his coffee, let him make small talk about Preston's new promotion, and then I simply slid the folder across the table and said, I found Walter Hale's letters in Grandma's closet. I watched my father's face in that moment more closely than I've ever watched anything in my life. There was no shouting, no dramatic denial, just a long silence, and then something in his shoulders seemed to fold inward, like a structure finally giving way after years of quiet stress fractures. She kept those, he said finally, not a question. She kept them, and she kept sending his family money for years, because she couldn't live with what you did. I said, Dad, you built this entire empire, this entire identity, this entire story you tell at every party, on $18,000 you never paid back to a man who trusted you. A man who worked himself into the ground so his kids could have something better, and instead his own family thought he was a failure because you let them believe it. His grandson is my husband. The man you've mocked at every family dinner for 3 years, the man you've called unstable and beneath us, is the grandson of the person who made your entire life possible. He didn't try to argue the facts. I think on some level he'd been waiting a long time for someone to finally say them out loud. What he did try to do was explain, the way people do when they've told themselves a comfortable story for so long that they've started to believe it. He talked about how difficult those early years were, how he genuinely intended to repay Walter, how the business kept needing capital, how one delay became another, how somewhere in there the shame of not having repaid it curdled into something uglier, a resentment toward Walter for the reminder itself, and eventually a kind of willful forgetting, the way you stop looking at a bill you can't bring yourself to pay. "I'm not asking you to explain it to me," I told him. "I'm asking you what you're going to do about it." I laid out what I wanted calmly without theatrics. I wanted him to personally go to Daniel's father, Walter's surviving son, the man he had quietly paid off and rushed out a side door at his own anniversary party, and tell him the truth, all of it, without lawyers softening the language, without a check meant to make the conversation end faster. I wanted the original debt, adjusted honestly for the decades that had passed, repaid not as hush money, but as an actual acknowledged repayment of an actual acknowledged debt. And I wanted him to stop the story, the self-made man's story, not necessarily announced to the world in some dramatic public confession, but stopped, quietly, permanently, replaced in his own mind and in our family's history with the truth that his empire had a co-founder no one ever credited, a man who died believing he'd failed his family, when in fact he had built someone else's fortune with his own hands. My father asked me if I intended to tell anyone else. Vanessa. Preston. My mother. The press, even though I think that question came from fear more than genuine suspicion. "That depends entirely on you," I said. "I'm not interested in destroying you. I'm interested in the truth existing somewhere other than a lockbox in a dead woman's closet. What happens next is up to you." I also placed the incorporation folder on top of the letters, the one showing the dissolution of Ashworth and Hale with no signature from Walter anywhere on it, and I watched my father's eyes move across that page longer than any of the others. "There's no record of him agreeing to sell his share," I said. "No buyout, no settlement, nothing. Legally, morally, however you want to measure it, he never stopped being owed something. He just stopped being mentioned." My father closed the folder himself gently, the way you'd close a book you weren't ready to finish. He didn't defend himself on that point. I think of everything I laid on that table, the missing signature was the one thing he couldn't find a comfortable story to wrap around. Some silences, it turns out, are louder than any confrontation could ever be. I left that diner not knowing what he would do. Daniel and I spent the following 2 weeks in a strange, suspended kind of quiet, not talking about it constantly, but feeling it underneath everything, the way you feel a storm building before it actually breaks. Then on a Tuesday evening, Daniel's phone rang. It was his father, and I could tell from Daniel's face, from the way his hand gripped the edge of our kitchen counter, that something significant was happening on the other end of that call. My father had gone to see him. Alone, no lawyer, no assistant running interference. He'd sat in Daniel's parents' modest living room, the same kind of house Walter himself had once lived in, and he had told them everything. The loan, the promissory note, the letters he'd ignored, the years of silence he'd let stretch out because acknowledging the debt meant acknowledging that his entire mythology was built on someone else's sacrifice. He'd apologized, not with the polished ease of a man delivering a prepared statement, but haltingly, according to Daniel's father, like a man who hadn't practiced humility in a very long time and wasn't sure how to hold it. He'd also brought a check. Not a hush payment but a formal documented repayment, calculated with actual interest across the actual decades, along with a letter, notarized, acknowledging Walter Hale's role in the founding of Ashworth Textiles, a document meant to exist permanently in the family record, whether or not it was ever made public. Daniel's father had cried on the phone telling Daniel this. He said the first thing he felt wasn't relief about the money. It was something quieter and more important. His father, Walter, the man he'd grown up believing was simply unlucky, simply unremarkable, was not unremarkable at all. He had been the invisible foundation under another family's fortune, and finally, decades too late for Walter himself to hear it, someone had said so out loud. I wish I could tell you the story ended there, tidy and warm, but families are rarely that simple, and mine certainly wasn't. My mother found out 3 weeks later, not from me, but from my father himself, who I think finally understood that carrying this alone was its own kind of unbearable weight. Her first reaction, according to my father, wasn't guilt. It was anger, specifically anger at him for jeopardizing everything we've built by telling the truth to people like that. When my father relayed that comment to me, quietly, almost apologetically, I understood something important. The unkindness toward Daniel had never really been about Daniel. It was about what his existence in our family threatened to reveal, a truth my mother had perhaps sensed for years without ever letting herself look at directly. I did eventually tell Vanessa and Preston, not to punish anyone, but because I believed they deserved to know the actual shape of our family history rather than the polished version we'd all been raised on. Vanessa's reaction surprised me. She didn't defend our parents the way I expected. She went quiet for a long moment and then said, "That explains something. Grandma used to get so strange whenever Dad told that story at parties. She'd leave the room. I always thought she just didn't like crowds." Preston, true to form, mostly wanted to know if this meant there were other skeletons that might affect the company's reputation, which told me everything I needed to know about where his priorities remained. The real turning point, the moment I think of as the actual closure of this whole story, happened 4 months later, at a much smaller gathering than the anniversary party. My grandmother, in her will, which none of us had fully understood until the estate was finalized, had left instructions for a modest memorial garden to be built behind the old house, the one she'd refused to leave, the one that was now technically mine, since she'd left the property to me specifically, along with a note that simply said, "You always understood what mattered." At the small dedication for that garden, just family, just a handful of people, my father did something I never expected. He stood beside a new stone bench installed under the oak tree, and without any prepared speech, without any of his usual polish, he told the true story of Ashworth Textiles. Not the version with the lone visionary and the single loom pulled up by sheer will. The real one. A young man with big dreams and no capital, and a friend named Walter Hale who believed in him enough to hand over every dollar he had saved, and a debt that took 40 years in his granddaughter's marriage to finally come due. Daniel's father was there. Daniel's mother too. My father looked directly at them when he said Walter's name, and his voice actually broke, just slightly, on the word friend. I watched Daniel standing there, this man my parents had once called beneath us, this man with sawdust permanently ground into the creases of his palms, listening to my father finally, publicly, say his grandfather's name with the respect it had always deserved. I watched my mother stand slightly apart from the group, arms crossed, still not entirely soft, still not entirely transformed, because people don't always change completely just because the truth finally catches up to them. But she didn't say anything cruel that day either. Maybe that was its own kind of progress. In the weeks after the memorial garden dedication, I found myself thinking often about the version of this story I almost told. There was a version where I mailed copies of those letters to the regional business magazine that had once profiled my father as a self-made visionary. There was a version where I stood up during his retirement dinner, the one his board was already planning for the following year, and read Walter Hale's last letter aloud to a room full of people who had spent decades admiring a myth. I thought about it more than once in the angriest weeks, when the unfairness of it all felt like something I needed to make loud in order for it to be real. But every time I imagined it, I came back to the same image, Walter's careful handwriting on that final letter, the line about not needing the money to feel whole, the line about only wanting to be remembered. A public spectacle would have served my anger. It would not have served him. Revenge dressed up as justice so easily curdles into something that's really just about the person seeking it, and I didn't want Daniel's grandfather's name attached, even posthumously, to something that looked more like a scandal than a truth. I wanted him remembered the way my grandmother had remembered him in secret for decades, quietly, faithfully, with the dignity that had been denied him in public for most of his life. So I chose the quieter path, and I won't pretend it didn't cost me anything. There were nights I resented my own restraint, wondered if I was simply protecting my family's comfort the way I'd watched my mother protect it my whole life. But watching Daniel's father hold that framed promissory note in his living room, running his thumb over his own father's real name printed where it belonged, in an official document permanent and undeniable, I understood that some kinds of justice don't need an audience to be real. They just need to exist somewhere true, somewhere it can't be erased again. I want to be honest that this story doesn't end with my mother suddenly embracing Daniel as the son she always wanted, Or with some perfect Hollywood reconciliation where everyone hugs and cries and the past is fully forgiven. My mother still has moments even now where an old comment slips out, a flicker of the same condescension, quickly caught and corrected but never fully gone. Some habits of the heart take longer than a single revelation to unlearn. But something fundamental did shift. Family gatherings stopped feeling like an audition Daniel was destined to fail. My father started asking Daniel real questions about his work, about the houses he'd restored, about the craft itself, and I could tell slowly that some of that interest was genuine. What mattered most to me wasn't watching my parents grovel or suffer or lose their social standing, because in the end, very little of this ever became public in the way I could have made it public. What mattered was watching Daniel's father, a man who had spent decades quietly believing his own father was simply someone who never amounted to much, finally understand the truth, that Walter Hale hadn't failed at all. He had built the foundation of an empire and then chosen again and again, not to destroy the man who forgot to thank him for it, even when that forgetting cost his own family everything. There's a photograph now, framed, sitting on the mantel in Daniel's parents' living room, the same black and white photograph we found in that lockbox. Two young men in front of a small brick building, arms around each other, believing the whole world was ahead of them. Next to it sits a copy of that old promissory note, framed as well, not as a trophy, not as evidence of anyone's guilt, but as a record. A reminder. Proof that Walter Hale existed, that he mattered, that the story people tell about self-made success is very often a story with quiet, uncredited hands holding it up from underneath. My father still runs Ashworth Textiles. My mother still hosts her galas. Nothing about our family's outward comfort changed dramatically, and I've made peace with that because that was never really the point. The point was that a man who worked himself into an early grave believing he'd failed his family finally got to be remembered accurately, even if it took his own passing and 40 years for that accuracy to arrive. Daniel and I got married the following spring, in a small ceremony at that same garden behind my grandmother's house, under the same oak tree. My father walked me down the aisle, and before he handed me off to Daniel, he leaned over and said something quietly, something just for me. "Your grandmother would be proud of what you found in that closet," he said. I know I wasn't, not at first. I am now. I looked over at Daniel standing there in a suit that fit him a little awkwardly, because formal wear was never really his thing, his hands still rough, still marked by years of honest work. And I thought about how close that truth had come to staying buried forever in a metal lockbox behind a false panel in a closet. I thought about how easily I could have let that anger consume the whole story instead of guiding it towards something more honest. And I thought about Walter Hale, a man I never met, whose careful handwriting I now knew almost as well as my own family's, whose quiet, undramatic sacrifice had shaped two families whether either of them wanted to admit it or not. My parents mocked me once for marrying below my class. I understand now that there was never any such thing as beneath us. There was only a family that forgot, for 40 years, whose shoulders they were really standing on, and a granddaughter who finally found the proof tucked away where it had been waiting patiently for someone to finally go looking.